Cameron, welcome to Rancho Mirage. I feel like this is a TV show of This Is Your Life. This book, I think everyone's gotten this book who's attending the festival. We've given out 1,500 copies.
So generous.
The graduating class of Rancho Mirage High School, each of the students have gotten this book.
Wow.
And what I'd like to ask you to do is start off by reading the introduction of that.
My pleasure.
Tell us who these people are.
I dedicate this book to my mother and father, who never faltered in their love or gave up on me in the face of a relentless tide of nightmares. I can only now begin to imagine how difficult it must have been for you. And to my loving family, Pappy, Granny, Anne, Catherine, Viviani, Lua, Dylan, Karis, Hudson, Hawk, Imara, and Uncle Jojo, thank you not for just affording me the opportunity to come back into your lives, but for welcoming me back with open arms. You all are my heart and soul and the force that drives me.
So tell us who some of the people are in this dedication to get us started.
It's basically, my immediate family. Granny is my beloved grandmother, who's no longer with us, who is always just such an avid supporter of me, really believing that I had a great future in front of me and my biggest champion.
She's Michael's and
she's
Jojo's mother.
She's my uncle Joel's mother and my father's mother. An amazing actress and writer in her own right.
Aren't you moving into her house?
Yeah, we are.
Tell us about that.
I'm in the middle of a move right now I live with my daughter and my daughter's mother, Vivian, and we have 2 dogs. And we're moving into this, my grandmother's lived in this house for, how long, Jojo? Like 60 years? 40 years? And so we're doing a little work on it because it needed a little TLC. It's been untouched for 40 years too. But yeah, we're looking forward to it. So.
And the other people in the dedication are?
Brothers and sisters. There's
Pappy,
my grandfather.
Kirk Douglas.
And just, I went through, as some of you know that read my book, some pretty difficult times, really of just, all of my own creation. But, my family rallied around me through it all. And
Catherine, you dedicate the book to Catherine and to your two. I think you have 4 half siblings.
Yep.
Karis and
5 actually.
Dylan.
5, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Hudson and
Hawk and Imar is my youngest sister.
Wow. So Eric, you open the book up with a story about being at Estaca in Mallorca, and your dad gets a phone call about your uncle Eric. Would you tell us about that moment and what happened? I think you're 25 years old, and you get this call.
Yeah, it was, we were in Spain. We have my mother and father have a beautiful house in Spain that I grew up going to every summer.
They say it's the most beautiful property in Mallorca.
It's gorgeous. It's a special place. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was from that area, so she sort of brought us all to that, magical little island and a little piece of it called Dea, which is on the northeast. It's a beautiful, very dramatic part of the island, the big cliffs and stuff like that. But we were having lunch, and the gentleman came over to my father and said he had a phone call, which is not out of the ordinary. And he went to take the phone call about 100 feet away from where we were having lunch. And I'll never forget this sound that started coming from where he had just walked over to. And at first I didn't know what it was, and then I realized it was a human. And you know, of course, it was my father who had just gotten the news about his brother, my Uncle Eric, who had overdosed. And
Eric was in his early 40s, I think.
He's in his early 40s, yeah.
So did you have reflection? I mean, at 25, you were already down your road on drugs, and did you have an identity with Eric, that his journey, that you might be repeating that journey? Is that?
I'm probably the only one that somehow refused to see that connection. You know, everybody would you know, growing up, Eric struggled for a while as well, and growing up, it was always like, you know, you have to be careful. You know, you look at your uncle; it's been difficult for him, and as I said, even you know, things were starting to get pretty bad, and somehow I was never able to make that connection. But looking back on it, yeah, we were similar in many ways. You know, Eric had his demons and was tormented and couldn't quite figure out how to get it figured out.
So let's see. Where were you born? Were you born in New York or West Coast?
I was born in Los Angeles at Cedar Sinai.
How old are you today?
How old am I? I'm 41.
41. Amazing, amazing.
Who's
Okay.
counting?
So your mom was only 19 when she married your dad, and they met at the Kennedy Center?
They did.
I was there that night.
Were you there?
I was there that night.
Wow, man! It sounded like an amazing night. I wish I could have been there. But well, maybe I was somehow in some kind of weird way. But yeah, no, it was. My mother is from Europe, and was not aware of who my father was or you know, his background, and I think she actually thought that he was an artist or a poet. You know, he had a big beard at that time,
Long hair.
And she was taken by him and he her.
That night, she wore white gloves, I think couture Chanel. She dressed so...
You remember seeing her?
I did. She was with Stuart, this friend of mine.
That's right.
And she, if you imagine, she was so opposite of a Southern California girl because
Right.
she had this beautiful, you know, peaches and cream complexion.
Yes.
And she had her hair up, and she was so stunning. And I think she swept her father off his feet.
I think so too. I think she had Jack Nicholson, Warren Beatty, and I think one other, all kind of, you know,
Everybody was competing
yeah,
for her.
competing for her, and my father won the day.
Then we went to Pisces
That's
Club
right,
afterwards.
man. Well, it's amazing you were there too.
Well, I was on the board of that club, so
That's no surprise, right?
so where did you grow up? The first, say, 6 or 10 years of your life? Did you go back and forth?
I was one of those kids that I moved back and forth between New York and California. I think I was born in Los Angeles. At 5 years old, I moved out to New York and was out there.
Were you in the city going to school?
I was in the city going to school, and then moved back to California, to Santa Barbara, for the end of elementary school. Then we moved back to New York, and I went off to boarding school in Massachusetts.
So, Eaglebrook.
Eaglebrook.
So when did you realize that your father was different from your friends' dads? When did you realize your dad was famous? What was a moment that you...
I don't know if there was a moment. I'm trying to think. I think it really started kind of, becoming a parent, around 10, 11. That's when I really started to notice it and maybe feel a little embarrassed by it or different than, yeah.
Did you feel entitled? Because I know you had folks in the house helping you. You had, people taking care of you, being surrogates for your father if he was traveling, working.
Right.
Your mother was traveling. So did you feel entitled. I don't mean to be pushy about that.
No,
word,
that's definitely a fair question. So both my mother and my father raised me with real manners, and I think when you're raised with those kinds of manners, it curbs any of that sort of entitlement, because you sort of treat everybody with respect, because that's how
everyone who met you, Cameron, at that point, from up through the Eagle Brook years, say that you were the nicest, the most polite, you were engaging, you were a terrific kid.
What the hell happened, man?
So, your dad goes to Eagle Brook, his roommate's Henry Kravis. He then goes on to Choate, to UC Santa Barbara. That's Dad. Young Cameron arrives. You have a football star at Eagle Brook. Eagle Brook is a junior prep from 6th, 7th, 8th grade. Then you go away to school. And then you wrestled. You were an athlete. And all of a sudden you did the gateway drug. Am I saying it right? The pot? You smoked a little pot?
Yeah.
And they didn't tolerate drugs, so what happened?
I was kicked out of Eagle Brook, and that was a real sort of shock to me. I remember feeling extremely guilty about that, and that's kind of what, where I began down that road.
But you went back to Eagle Brook.
I went back
Your dad basically, you all made a deal. Go back, finish.
My father's always been about finishing strong. That's like, his sort of log line for me. It's always been about finishing strong. So I really, when I think things really took a turn for the worse for me, was as Jamie was saying, I was very into athletics for most of my youth. And then I quit the football team in 11th grade, and I just somehow knew that that decision was pivotal.
And you're living in Santa Barbara.
Living in Santa Barbara.
And all of a sudden you start hanging out with this bad crowd, and all of a sudden you become a skateboarder. I remember you going through the streets of New York, holding on to trucks, skateboard. You had no sense of danger as a teenager. And then you started getting into fights with guys bigger than you and gangs. And you were really a scrappy.
I was scrappy. I think, part of the thing, with coming from my family is I always felt like I had to just sort of, do everything just a little bit more than how everybody else was doing it. So if somebody else was exhibiting some kind of crazy behavior in my peer group, I felt like I had to just push it a little bit further.
So you
sort of prove
So
myself.
in high school, you start really down the road to doing drugs and getting into trouble, and then you are basically at this point you're sent away to various school programs. Can we talk about some of these programs? La Posada. We're talking about the Utah, and talk about Outward Bound. And you went to. These are all very expensive.
Well, no. So when I was expelled from Eagle Brook, I went to this program called SUS, and what that was, it was like this rigorous outdoor program for about 3 weeks in the desert.
And you liked it. You did really well there.
I don't know if I liked it, but I did. I did do pretty well.
You did well. You said survival. It was a really.
It was. It was sort of about accomplishment and just getting away from everything, and it was a good experience. Although I don't think they offer those programs anymore because kids were actually
Today, Cameron, I know several people whose children have been in these lockdown programs in Utah. They seem to be, and and we know that you've been part of that. But if you were looking, what would you do today if you had a son or daughter who was at this point in 14 to 15, 16 years old? His parents seem to have tried everything with you, and you know, and this is before Juvenile Hall, which was as a next step. I want to talk about that. But what would you do if as a parent? These are grandparents here, and they, I'm sure, might face this themselves.
Yeah, no, I think that you do everything you can do, meaning, you know, you give all the love and support you can, but up until a point. I think there comes a point where for better or for worse, you have to let go and kind of let nature take its course. And the
I mean, tough love by saying, "I'll cut you off financially and live on the streets." Or,
well,
would you do that?
Everybody's scenario is different, but what I'm saying is I think that addicts reach a point where they have to find themselves. You think you get to a point, and I'm not suggesting that's, you know, when you're a teenager. Yeah. Or, you know, even in your early 20s, but there does come a point where the individual, there's nothing that anybody can do for them, and they have to either find their way or not. And that's, you know, it's just, it's a vicious addiction, affliction.
Every time you came out, I was rooting for you to stay clean, and yet you slipped right back. And you were a good addict.
Yeah.
I mean, you
diligent.
hit it well. You did the shots that you were. Tell us the difference between heroin, Chiva, and Coke, and the difference of effect it had on you. Because in your book, you talk about this, that I moved from this drug to that drug, and this is better, or this was, it treated me differently. Can you talk about how that, without getting, I don't want to drug-a-log today, but I want these people to know this is a journey that you had and the trials.
So, I mean, you can't get much more different than cocaine and heroin. I mean, they're just two total opposites.
What's Chiva?
That's heroin. That's
heroin. So what's the difference in the effect, and how do you smoke one and shoot the other? I mean, I don't.
I mean, you really can. You can use them any way you choose to. Of course, injecting it intravenously is the most potent way, and obviously the most dangerous.
Are you able to function when you're on these drugs? Are you able to be?
Well, you have what's, I mean, you know, people, they call them functioning addicts, you know, which are people that have these addictions, and they.
Well, that's what you were, really, in a certain sense, sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could call it that, although I don't know, it didn't do much for me. I'm certainly not functioning then the way that I'm functioning now.
Isn't it amazing?
But yeah, no, it is. It's.
So I still dream of having a martini. Do you still have the feelings that you like to go back that way?
I mean, I paid such a high price, you know, for my addiction, that the idea of dibbling and dabbling with those drugs that took me to the places that I went, it's just unconscionable, really.
Do you mind reading these two paragraphs there?
Sure. Recklessness was the norm in my life. It was present in the way I rode my motorcycle in Mallorca, in the way I drove a car in California, in the way I interacted with people if I went to a party where I didn't know anyone. It was just how I approached the world. The very real possibility of something going terribly wrong felt okay at the time, but maybe it's also what, together with years of drug addiction, later morphed into the intense anxiety I always felt. I was the ringleader of our group, the maker of plans, chooser of destinations, finder of trouble, and the one most likely to keep a bender going for days on end. A lot of the time, we'd all hang out in my pool house. I had good manners and an easy rapport with adults, and my friends' parents would say things like, "Cameron's such a nice boy." Mom disapproved of my friends, and Dad called me the king of the shits. But given all that was going on with them, they were hardly present to impose structure on my life.
Thank you, Cameron. Thank you. Cameron, at one point in the book, you say you had trust fund and you had income, and that it wasn't enough to sustain your life with your friends, that you were carrying a whole group of people with you, from girlfriends to guys. And you sort of was one of the reasons you say that pushed you into dealing drugs. Am I wrong about that, or is that the impression I got in the book?
Well, I was making a decent living pretty early on. I had
DJing.
I had a pretty solid career as a DJ.
Tell them how much you were making. And when you went to Germany, you were making like $10,000 a night.
It depends. In the corporate events, you usually make much more. You could make up to $50,000-$60,000 for maybe 2-3 hours of work. Or if at a nightclub, maybe anywhere from, I'd say, $4,000 to $8,000 for an evening, right, which is like 4 hours of work. And it's a great life. I mean, I love music. I always have. I love to travel, and it's really a great way to make your way around the world and meet people. And so it was good. But it's also slightly conducive to drug use. and so that's just, it was not a, it was just a matter of time, really.
There's a moment in your book where you described playing with Sean Lennon. You were both 13 years old. And I was thinking his journey was not the same as yours. And I'm sure there are other kids and celebrities that didn't go to the extreme that you did.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely pushed the envelope. That's for sure.
And so you had this, I remember you stole the car, and then you had a police car in Santa Barbara. And I mean, you were really, you're lucky that you're alive through all these adventures that you had.
I am. I mean, it's one thing about life that's amazing to me is that it truly is ever changing. As I'm sure most of you have experienced. It's, as long as you're breathing, there's always an opportunity around the corner, and it's exciting that way. I think life.
So you went through the juvenile system, and my understanding, talking to judges before I interviewed you today, is that the juvie hall, you call it the gladiator school in one reference that you make, that it's not to punish you, but it's to rehabilitate you. Are there any changes you would make that you can think of as you were reflecting on what you went through that you think would be good for the juvenile delinquent and the system?
It's difficult because they're dealing with such a volume of kids, but the juvenile system is really their goal is to sort of try to rehabilitate the
You went to school. You were going to classes. I think you got your GED, high school diploma, through basically while you were in the system.
I was made a ward of the Court of California. I spent a lot of time in juvenile hall, and there's a progression with the juvenile system, and it starts with juvenile hall, and then it goes to what's called boys camp, and then from boys camp you'd go to youth authority, and that's really the end of the line. That's the real gladiator school. That's a really dangerous place to be.
Wow.
But the thing with juveniles is
and you survived this. I mean, you are a survivor. I mean, you're not the biggest kid there, and yet you take care of yourself. I have a lot of respect for that. The fact you got through that.
Well, one thing that I'm in great awe of about humans is one, the ability that we have to adapt. If you look at most any other animal in nature, if you take them out of their environment, 8 out of 10 times they don't survive. Humans have this amazing ability to adapt to their surroundings. One, and two, the will that humans have to survive is incredible.
So take us through what did you do, and when you got into the jail, the prisons, you were dealing drugs. Take us a little bit through that narrative of how you went to prison, and I want to go through the first sort of the stages of the prison, because I learned a lot from your story about this.
Yeah, my sojourn through prison was atypical, to say the least, as my life had been before that. I started out at a minimum security prison, which is, if you're in prison, is probably
It's a federal prison.
federal prison. Yeah.
So all of a sudden you're in this minimum security. Tell us what you were doing at night.
Well, minimum security prisons are. There's a couple. You have to have less than 10 years on your sentence to be in a minimum security prison, and you have to have no violence on your record. So it's a fairly safe place to be.
Is it mostly drug related? Is that what minimum security?
White collar and drug related, and you can't be you can't be a sex offender at a low security prison.
Right.
So it's a pretty safe place to be, but the thing is there's no fences or walls. So
no fences or walls.
So inmates get very creative in bringing things in from the outside.
And you got very creative going outside.
I did.
And you started having affairs with local ladies, and ladies would drive up to meet you. I don't mean to be telling your story, but it was really fascinating.
One woman, my girlfriend, but
she would be there and wait for you, and
yeah, that's something that you could do. It was,
and you got back into the prison before the bed check or whatever they did too.
Yeah, they do their rounds. Yeah, so that was I thought I was in prison, and then I realized as I started to work my way up in the security classifications that in fact I wasn't in prison at all at that point, and so I ended up working my way up to a maximum security prison.
But you were already, if you stayed in that and behaved or followed the rules, you would have been let out. You were, but then you started bringing drugs in, and you were basically caught dealing. Well, I'm skipping ahead. First, you're charged and went for the courts, the federal courts. Mm-hmm. You were charged with, I think, dealing.
Well, I was charged with a drug conspiracy.
Drug conspiracy, and it was a large conspiracy, and the judge sentenced you to, what was the sentence?
Initially, it was 5 years.
5 years. Cameron, in reflection, do you think the judge may have been sort of the hero in this and helping you get clean and sober down the road with what happened to you, or do you still have this adverse feeling toward the judge?
I'm not a big fan of the judge personally, but I don't give him credit for me becoming sober and getting my life together.
Okay.
But I do, was for better or for worse, it was the road that I walked down, and I tried my best to. I reached a certain point. So what happened is I was given a second sentence on top of that one. So I was 5 years turned into 10 years.
And you were almost finishing the 5 years, weren't you, Cameron, when you got sentenced to an additional time?
I was probably about a year and a half away from coming home, and so I was given a doubled my sentence.
Because you?
They doubled my sentence because, in fact, I wouldn't agree to cooperate against the people that were on my case, and they weren't happy about that. That was something that I said I would do.
It was a plea bargain. It was a plea bargain that you agreed to.
Yeah, and then I reneged on that.
Do you regret that decision?
No.
Reneging on that?
No, I don't. Because listen, I mean, of course, there's a lot of things in life that I regret and that I wish I'd done differently. But the fact is that where I'm at today is my life is good. I'm starting to build a career for myself, and I have a beautiful daughter.
Tell us about. I'm going to jump ahead, but tell us a little bit about the movies you just. I watched you. You look like a great cop. You look like a detective. I mean, you have the look, and you have the voice for it, and you've just made 1 or 2 movies. I think you.
Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, I just finished a movie in which I play a detective, and it was fun. And I have a movie coming up in April, and I play a detective as well. So
you've joined the other side.
That's right.
You joined the other side. Do you know how to use a gun?
Yeah.
You shot pistols and all that?
Mm-hmm.
Did you do that growing up, or was this something that you took
Well, I've
up?
just been out, where farms or whatever, you go out to, out back and shoot at bottles and things like that.
Right. So what I was touched by in the book is you grew up. Talk about the animals that you grew up at Estaca in Mallorca, because you all had an exotic menagerie of animals, and then your love of dogs. Throughout the book, if you're a dog lover, the story of Junior is, I mean, Junior's almost a person in your life. And so tell us about, first of all, growing up as a kid, you had a monkey, you had all this menagerie, and your mother sort of encouraged this.
Yeah, well, my mother, she has an affinity for rare animals. So we've had some pretty interesting animals. We had a serval, which is like.
What is that?
A serval is looks like it's an African cat. Looks like a cheetah, but it's smaller, maybe half the size.
Did it bite your dad one time or something that you were telling a story about? The monkey or?
Well, no, he was in the middle of a meeting, and he used to like to, it has these stalking instincts, these hunting instincts. So one of its favorite games was to stalk. So oftentimes I would wake up in the middle of the night, and he'd be right in my face, like kind of stalking me. And one afternoon, my father was in a meeting, and and this cat, they can jump like 20, 30 feet at a time. It's pretty amazing. And flew out of the next room and right onto his head. He was wrestling around trying to get it off, and he did, and he was bleeding afterwards. And the woman that he was having a meeting with was just like, she didn't know what was going on. It was funny. I remember that still.
So, tell us about Junior.
Junior is a chocolate lab that I had. That was just an amazing dog. Incredibly smart. He used to just kind of time his life and his sort of routines around my schedule, which was crazy. But he was just that amazing, probably the best dog I've ever had, and maybe ever will have.
Did you think about cloning Junior?
I did. He passed away while I was still in prison, and I was pretty sad about that. But I read that they did this thing in Japan. There was a company that was cloning pets. They did it with horses, and I asked my girlfriend to get a DNA sample, and of course, so we went through all of that. Made me feel a little bit better about his passing. But then a couple of years ago, I got another great chocolate lab, so gave up on that.
Truck,
yes.
Cameron, so tell us about you're in solitary confinement, and my daughter gave the Annenberg Award to an artist a couple of years ago that closed a solitary prison in Indiana. It's just lots of people are against it. So you're in solitary. What's in your cell? Is it just the bed, toilet, a desk? And what do you do with your time in solitary? Do you have access to a TV or laptop or books, or what is what?
No, no laptop, no TV. You have usually a bunk bed, and a toilet connected to your sink.
It looks like a very hard bed. It's like it's not sort of
No,
mattress.
no, yeah, it's just.
They change the sheets once a week or towels, and where's it? You go to a common shower down the hall, and
Can. I mean, it depends on. They're all these, institutions are built a little bit differently.
but you learn how to get your own privacy, which I think is amazing. You were very adept at being able to survive in this. I mean, most people wouldn't have been able to survive this. You did. And what was your nickname in prison? Hollywood?
Oh yeah.
And then growing up, you had Chameleon, Cameron.
Yeah, right.
Cameron.
Chameleon, yes.
I
I think I hear people say that fairly often about not being able to survive these things, and I have to disagree. I think anybody could survive it.
Did you read a lot?
I read a lot. Yes, I read a lot. I mean, that's what I did. So it's interesting. I spent almost 2 years in solitary confinement, and so.
How'd you get your meals? Did they bring them to you? I mean, you didn't see anybody else?
Excuse me?
You didn't see anybody else?
Yeah, they bring you your meals through a little slot. They unlock the slot.
God.
They pass you.
No choice of entrees.
No choice of entrees. But to your question about how I passed my time and what I did and what I learned, one, about the human brain, which is pretty incredible,
Yes.
is, I made a curriculum for myself, and that curriculum consisted of reading. I'd read, 3 books at a time. One would be...
Classic? I think you read one was a classic.
Yeah, one would be like English lit classic, like a Charles Dickens or Jack London or Ernest Hemingway, something that you may read in an English lit class. Another one would be a self-help book, like Jack Kornfield or Eckhart Tolle, something along the lines of that. And then the other one would be what I'd call like my beach read, which would be like Game of Thrones or, just something fun. So that was the reading.
You could bring the library cart around to the cell, and you would take books off.
They do. They have a little cart, but it's most of the books that I would read, I would have sent to
you
from family and friends. Because what I did was I built a curriculum for myself, and it was reading, and then writing, poetry, journaling, and then eventually the beginning of this book, exercise and meditation. That was kind of like my curriculum. And I remember thinking to myself, it was all I could do to get these 4 things in a day and eat my meals. And I used to sit there and think to myself, how does anybody get anything accomplished out in the real world in the course of a day? I mean, if I can't even do these 4 things in this teeny little box. But what it was it's your brain compressing the time so you don't lose your mind, so your brain literally compresses the time. So it's still a 24-hour day, but the way that my brain deals with it is it just shortens it. And that happens on a lesser scale in general population in prison. It's how these people pass these long prison sentences, is because, the time gets compressed. So it's pretty fascinating, actually.
And I love that your family came to visit you. Catherine came, she brought the kids. I also love the fact you wrote letters. There was your principal communication. I know there was a phone call that you could make, but you wrote these great letters back and forth between your grandparents and yourself. And your grandparents never gave up on you. Your father never gave up on you. And the love that you had is extraordinary, and you didn't give up on yourself.
I don't know if that last part is true, but there's definitely some times I wavered. But yeah, no, it's true. The love of my family and my close friends were really the sort of force that allowed me to start making the steps that would eventually lead to sitting on the stage with you all here today. So,
Cameron, so you really bulked up and you worked out, you were in prison, and while you're there, you also started getting tattoos. Is that normal, people giving tattoos in prison and getting them? Is that, but you got a lot of tattoos.
Yeah, a lot of tattoos.
And I love the picture of your grandfather and your dad. I mean, this is amazing. You talk about, I've heard you being interviewed that you might get some of your tattoos removed. Isn't that painful?
Not, I mean, the only ones I'm getting removed are these ones you can barely see anymore.
Oh, right.
And if I knew really what it entailed, I might have left them on, but I'm already 7 sessions in, so
right.
We're almost there.
So Cameron, looking back at prison, if you were to be the administrator of prisons, what would you change?
Well, that's a long conversation, but I think, initially, the structure in our prison systems and the way that they're run haven't changed in hundreds of years, and so there needs to be a new approach, and you see this approach in countries like Europe. They approach criminal justice and incarceration in a different way, and the results speak for themselves.
We have a lot less recidivism in the European prisons than we have. We have the highest recidivism.
Yeah, because the prisons in this country, they treat the men and women in there like animals, and then you get treated like an animal. You start acting like an animal. But the problem with that is that 90% of all the men and women in prison are coming home one day. Right. And so I just feel like the government owes the taxpayers more. They should be turning out men and women that are reformed.
Cameron, would you talk a little bit about when you hurt your leg? I think you almost broke it, and they mistreated. Tell us a little bit of that story and what happened at the end.
Well, it's another one of those sort of nightmarish stories in prison. But I broke my femur, and so from the time that I broke my femur, it was a compound fracture. I had a little piece of bone sticking out of my knee.
Gosh.
It was 5 days until I got to the hospital, and
you kept asking. You were in terrible pain. I couldn't believe they didn't take you right away.
Yeah, no, they did. They gave me some ibuprofen and some water, and but anyways, so that happened on a Monday. I finally got to the hospital on a Friday, and the doctor asked when it happened, and I told him, and I saw this look on his face, and he said, "We need to give you an MRI immediately, because at this point, the real danger is that you could have a blood clot, and if that thing gets to your lungs or your brain, it could be the end of the story." So they rushed me into this MRI, and indeed I had an 8-inch blood clot in my leg, and they had to give me an emergency surgery to insert a filter right here, I guess, where all your veins come together. But they did end up paying me $90,000 a couple of years later for that little mishap. So
very good. Cameron, this has been a really great experience. We've become friends through this process.
Absolutely.
You've been with us at Thanksgiving. Helene and I have gotten to know you. We know your lady and your daughter. I'd like you to read. This is the last paragraph in the book, and I hope you'll listen to this. This is Cameron. It ends the book, and I just cried in it. I thought it was so beautiful.
Thank you.
Describe the setting and.
So this is, my favorite place in the world is this little town called Dea in Mallorca, and I used to do this thing when I was in prison, where I'd close my eyes and I'd try to imagine this place, and I tried to envision it like as clearly as I could. And then I'd open my eyes, and I'd still be surrounded by, wherever I was. And I did that so that one day, when I made it to this place, I would do the same, close my eyes, and try to imagine prison as clearly as I could and then be here. So I'll read it for you. It says, on our way out to sea, I witnessed the most amazing shooting star of my life with a long tail and appearing very close. When we're out a ways,
You're swimming out there.
we're on the boat at this point still, but when we're out a ways, Sam, who's always been wild, says he's going to swim back to shore. That sounds pretty amazing to me, and I jump in first. The phosphorescence is active, and we trail glowing streamers behind us as we swim. I flip onto my back and just float there, looking up at the stars. The sky is so clear, and we're so far from a city that it feels like we're in a planetarium. After all these years in prison, when I fantasized about the future, now I close my eyes and imagine I'm back behind bars, then open them, taking in the sea and the sky and the stars, and letting my appreciation for my freedom fill me. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.